Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. My name is Alexandra Sandu. I'm the Assistant Program Director for the Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's webinar entitled Shāfiʿī Good Old Boys, Educational Networks, Poetry, and the Revival of the Baghdad Caliphate at the Time of the Crusades. The Humanities Research Fellowship for the Study of the Arab World is a program that aims to build a platform of outstanding research relevant for the study of the Arab world from a variety of disciplinary backgrounds. We started the program in 2014, and I'm happy to say that for the last 8 years, the program hosted over 50 junior, mid-career, as well as senior scholars from all over the world. We have a yearly cohort of fellows of 8 to 10 scholars in residence here at NYU Abu Dhabi, conducting research and hosting events with fellows, faculty, as well as external colleagues. We are very grateful to Professor Maurice Pomerantz, who is a program head for the Arab Crossroads Studies, as well as Associate Professor of Literature at NYU Abu Dhabi, for moderating our event today. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alex. Well, welcome everyone, and a special welcome to our guest tonight in Abu Dhabi, Nathaniel A. Miller. Nathaniel Miller was born in Rhode Island in the United States. He, in his undergraduate degree, he moved to the Midwest, to Northfield, Minnesota at St. Olaf College, and he has also done an MA in English literature at the University of Indiana at Bloomington. It was there that he started to study Arabic, and we're very grateful that he did that. He went on and lived and worked in Egypt from 2000 to 2010 and did a program probably known to many scholars of Arabic literature, the program called the Center for Arabic Studies Abroad, CASA, which was hosted at that time at the American University in Cairo in 2009. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago, and he graduated in 2016 with a PhD. He worked with a great scholar and colleague, Tahira Qutb-ud-Din, there on a wonderful dissertation on the Ash'ar al-Hudhayliyyin, which related to group identity in early Arabic poetry. And now we're lucky that he's here in Abu Dhabi, and that he's working on finishing this work as a monograph and turning it into the kind of wonderful scholarly work that I know it will be. He comes to us most immediately from a fellowship at the University of Cambridge, where he was from 2017 to 2020. And we're very excited to have him here tonight to really talk about, I guess, a new project in part. So thank you very much. One note of, I guess, procedure. If you have questions, and I hope you do, please place them in the Q&A function. And at the conclusion of the talk, Professor Miller has kindly agreed to answer some of these questions, and I'll be fielding them. So please hold on to them or write them in the Q&A as they come to you. And so take it away, Professor Miller.
Thank you very much, Morris. All right, so I'm going to try to thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to try to share my screen now. Boy, okay. And is that working? Okay. Hopefully someone will let me know if that isn't visible. I picked this title to try to narrow down this monstrous anthology that I'm working on, called Kharidat al-Qasr wa Jaridat al-Asr, The Pearl of the Palace and the Annals of the Age by ʿImād al-Iṣfahānī from the 12th century. And I think I bit off a bit more than I could chew, so we'll see how much I get through. We'll deal with most of these topics. The last one is the revival of the Caliphate. We'll see if we get to that. So a research question that you can ask about poetry during this time period, and poetry is my main concern, is did the advent of the madrasa in the 11th century make Muslims more Sunni, or did it make Sunnis less traditionalist, by which I mean more hadith oriented or less hadith oriented, and more open to other fields of inquiry like adab or falsafa or anything else that you might, sort of humanistic discipline that might have come across. The reason why I'm adding as a case study for this is because he attended the famous Nizamiya madrasa in, well, two of them in Baghdad and in Isfahan. You didn't have to go to one university back in the day. And the first thing that we're going to do is just look at a survey of his life before I try and dive into these larger social questions that he exemplifies. Some of this might be, I don't know, a bit of on a survey level. But let's just talk about who Ḥimād al-Iṣfahānī is. So you might be looking at this picture and you say, that's not exact. That's not Ḥimād al-Iṣfahānī. That's the guy from Game of Thrones. And the reason why I had that picture there is because he plays a very fictionalized version of Ḥimād al-Iṣfahānī in sort of mediocre movie from 2005, Kingdom of Heaven, which is about Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187. And that is the way that Ḥimād al-Dīn really gets remembered most of the time, as being a sort of henchman for Salah ad-Dīn al-Ayyubi, for Saladin during the Crusades. And he did play an extremely large role in the inception of the Ayyubid dynasty in Cairo and Damascus. And he was actively involved in everything Saladin was doing, fighting against the Crusaders and other Muslim states in the Levant. But he had a lot of other stuff going on in his life as well, as you can see from this rather too busy slide. He was born in 1125. I just decided to opt with the sort of common era dates here. And a really seminal event in his life came in 1132, when his uncle, who was an administrator also in the Seljuk administration, was killed for expropriation of funds, which is the way that a very large number of administrators from this time period met their fate. For an unknown reason, his family went to Baghdad from Isfahan, and he started studying at the Nizamiya and then later the Thiqatiyya madrasas. So these were madrasas that were new in the Islamic world. They were set up as state-sponsored affairs by Nizam al-Mulk, the wazir, and I'm not actually sure who was behind the Thiqatiyya madrasa, but later on you see caliphal patronage of these institutions. After a few years, his family returns to Isfahan, and he studies poetry with a bunch of people who are otherwise kind of unknown, particularly one figure named Majd al-Arab al-Amari. And he really focuses on poetry for about 6 years, it seems. He goes in 1154 on the Hajj, and then spends a few more years in Baghdad, and he stays at the Nizamiya madrasa there as a resident. And eventually enters into the administrative service, basically in revenue collection, tax collection, under the Vizier Ibn Hubayra. And at the end of that, in 1165, he was briefly imprisoned. And through his connections, he was able to make his way to Damascus, where he started to work in the chancery of Nur ad-Din Zengi, a sort of post-Seljuk minor ruler in the Levant in Damascus. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, he managed to connect himself to Saladin, and they had, Nur ad-Din and Saladin had a tense relationship, so it took a little bit of diplomatic work for this. And in 1178, he completed the Kharida that we'll be talking about. And over the course of the next 10 years, he was involved in Saladin's military campaigns, culminating in the reconquest of Jerusalem in 1187. And after Saladin's death, he retires to a madrasa where he had an official post. Probably didn't involve very much work, where he completed an appendix to the Kharida called the Veil Kharida al-Qasr. And he dies in 1201 in Damascus. Why did he write this? As I mentioned, it's 10 manuscript volumes of poetry. It's 17 volumes in its print edition, the first page of which, the title page of which is there, published in 1955 in Baghdad. One was to commemorate his martyr uncle, Aziz ad-Din. That was how it started. He says that there was a lot of poetry that was composed for him, and he didn't want it to vanish from memory, so he set about collecting it. The other was he refers a lot to his youth with this figure Majd al-Arab in particular, and a few other Isfahānī literary figures. While he was working in the Baghdad financial administration, he seems to have been pursuing poetry collection as a kind of hobby. And then he continued that hobby under Saladin and the Ayyubid family. He composed an enormous amount of poetry himself, predominantly panegyric for the various patrons that he worked under. He included a lot of panegyric for Saladin and the Ayyubids, and he would also include poetry by the caliphs and by the Ayyubid family. It was an advantageous position to have, these various political positions that he held. Here's an example of how he was able to collect and save poetry that we otherwise wouldn't have. As a result of his work under Saladin. So he says, book sales used to be held in the Fatimid Palace twice weekly. So Saladin, of course, dissolved the Ismaili Fatimid Caliphate around 1171, I believe, in Cairo. And the effects of the caliphs, the Fatimid caliphs, were liquidated. And many of the administrators for Saladin were able to take advantage of this and get cheap books. So he says, books are sold at very low prices. I did like everyone else and took advantage of the situation by buying a number of precious books. And then this is an example that he's giving of the Sultan's generosity. I informed him of what I had bought. He granted me their price as a gift and added to it by giving me more books from the palace's shelves than I'd even selected. I once entered into his presence and found him examining a large number of folios from the palace's collection. And he asked me, aren't these some of the books that you selected? All of them, I replied, and I would not let go of a single one. So he ordered a porter to carry them all to my house. This was but one example of his generosity. It was his custom to give without making one ask what was needed. How have people made use of this interesting resource? Well, in order to reconstruct literary histories, largely in the 20th century from a sort of national or regional perspective. And that's reflected in the publication history of this. So here, I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want to give you an idea of what a mess the state of the manuscripts is in. All of these sections, and the Kharida is organized geographically according to these sections. There's an Iraq section, a Persia section, a Syria section that contains the Hejaz and Yemen as well tacked on, an Egypt section, and then a Maghreb section, a West section that includes North Africa, Sicily, and Spain. All of these are dispersed in different places, and full manuscripts. There are no full manuscripts of the Kharida in one place. And combined with the emergence of independent Arabic states in the latter half of the 20th century, that meant that most of these sections were published independently of each other by different editors in different countries. So that's one use that you can put the Kharida to, is trying to figure out, for example, what was happening in Egypt during the 11th century, say, because the Ismaili Shia were in control. There tends to not be a lot of good information from Sunni sources, and al-Dīn gives us some material to fill in that blank. A second use that it's put to is historical, the history of the Crusades. And in this, he has been quite well served. Here are a few relatively recent studies. These people, like Karel Hillenbrand or Anne-Marie Day, draw on the Kharida, but they're usually in the prose snippets where he talks about things that he was doing with Saladin or his own biography, and then they draw on his other works. He produced an interesting sort of memoir of himself and Saladin called al-Barq al-Shami, the Syrian lightning. So the problem with drawing on the Kharida or on his texts without looking at it from a literary perspective, if you look at it just from a historical perspective, you miss out on what he has done as a creative individual in shaping the anthology. So here's a quote from Bilal Orfali, and he says that the originality of a particular anthology consists precisely in the choice and the arrangement of the reproduced texts. And together they reveal the interests and objectives of the compiler. You take the context into account. And even though the material might not be the compiler's original work, it substantiates a vision that is strictly his own. And a number of other scholars like Hilary Kilpatrick and Shaukat Tarawa, just to name a few, have made similar points and demonstrated this with painstaking work on other anthologies. Another recent scholar has pointed out that looking at everything that ʿImād has done from the point of view of propaganda ignores what's really in the Kharida. If you just leave the all of the poetry about love and wine and whatever all to one side and just focus on panegyric and things that deal directly with the Crusades, you miss the larger point. And so Matt Keegan says poetry was not addressed to a public, but rather it was a form of elite communication in which social identity was performed, negotiated, and consolidated. Furthermore, ʿImād's anthology does not marginalize Shiite voices in the interest of promoting a Sunni vision of a counter-crusade, he means here, or insist on portraying rulers as ascetics, i.e. as very religious, again, as Sunni counter-crusaders. And Keegan looks at one particular poet, Aqala al-Kalbi, who has licentious poetry about Shiism, poetry about wine, that was performed for Saladin, and argues that we shouldn't be reducing ʿImād to a counter-crusading propagandist for a new Sunni regime, which is a very valid point, although there are a number of things that ʿImād leaves out. And as you're reading, he does produce probably much more than we might think, looking back on it in the 20th century, that perhaps we might suppose that he wouldn't have reproduced it because it was obscene or because it was unorthodox. But there are also quite a number of places where, for example, I was just reading, there was a particular poet who has a long, obscene screed against the city of Isfahan because he hadn't found patrons there probably to subsidize his poetry production, and he had to leave. And ʿImād says, I'm only going to give one half of a verse of this. So that's an example of how he shapes what we are receiving. Now, in terms of the history of religious thought that supposedly coincides to some extent with the counter-crusade, there is an idea in the scholarship that there was a Sunni revival that took place in the 11th century as a result of the Seljuks' sponsorship of religious learning, and that this continued and was revived under the Ayyubids. So the three main points that can be raised in favor of the idea of a Sunni revival are the dissolution of the Buyid Sultanate following the Seljuk conquest of Baghdad under Tilrobeg in 1055, the sponsorship of specifically Shafi'i madrasas like the Nizamiya in Baghdad and Isfahan by his famous vizier Nizam al-Mulk, and the incredibly seminal theological work of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who is responding in large part to Ismaili Shi'ism and in a way proposing a kind of alternative that allows for a more esoteric element to Sunnism by incorporating Sufism into a traditionalist framework of Islam. Now, one scholar, for example, who gives more of a sort of hard view of the Sunni revival is Omid Safi, who describes this combination of three things as a Seljuk ideological state apparatus. Most scholars disagree with him. Two that I benefited from, Nathan Hoffer, he's looking at a later period, but he's talking about popularization and the institutionalization of Sufism under the Ayyubids and early Mamluks. And Daphne Efrat, who is looking at the 11th century. And the thing that they have in common is to look at the popular aspects of what was going on, as well as the institutional aspects. And a quote that kind of sums up this critique from Efrat: the mainstream Sunni camp in Baghdad emerged out of internal dynamics, independently of the official sphere, and it was little affected by the policies of the Seljuks. Okay, and then this will be the last lit review sort of point to make. There's been a lot of good recent research into the Mamluk period, which has been ignored both in the Arab world and in the West, as a period of decadence and less splendor than under the Abbasid Caliphate or a bit later. And one of the characterizations by Thomas Bauer, a German scholar, of what happens during the early Mamluk period is what he calls the ulamatization of Adab and the Adabization of the ulamat, by which he means that the ulamat, the religious scholars, are getting much more interested in literature, and the literary people who are producing literature are increasingly ulamat. So instead of professional court poets like the famous ones, al-Buhtari, al-Tamam, al-Mutanabbi, who make their living from, apparently really, really good living from poetry, there are more figures like al-Haysabaisa, Tughra'i, who many people have not heard of. But Haysabaisa was a Shafi trained religious scholar, like ʿImād Tughra'i was a katib, a clerk in the chancery. And this impression can be substantiated in by looking at documents and manuscripts. And a recent example of that is Konrad Herschler's book on medieval Damascus, from the study of a library catalog from the Ashrafiyya madrasa in Damascus. One of the points that he makes is that the adab, or literature, titles in the catalog comprised about 45% of the total content, as opposed to about 24% devoted to religious sciences. And Bauer refers to what's happening here as textualization, and there's a lot of evidence that learning and hadith transmission and the reading of literary texts, literacy in general, is becoming more widespread in other social circles, not just in elite ones, and popularization. And so what I am aiming to do is to try to, in this particular talk, is to try to look at the mechanics of that a little bit more. So we can think about it in terms of social networks. And I don't have any sophisticated data analysis model for this, but you'll probably see what I mean as I go along. One aspect of this, which is just really clear from ʿImād al-Dīn's biography, is the extent to which he was plugged into networks of scholars who are affiliated with the Nizamiya madrasas. He was educated first in Isfahan, the Nizamiya madrasa. He lived in one in Baghdad again in the 1150s while he tried his hand at being a court poet for the Abbasid caliph. And he had a relationship with the chief Qadi in Damascus, whose son had gone to the Baghdad Nizamiya, and that helped him make an entree into Damascus society. So it's quite clear that he just would not have existed at all as a literary figure if he had not had these religious scholarly connections to help him transfer from one milieu to the next, particularly moving from one city to another. So an example of this that I'm going to look at a bit more closely is from the Iraqi city of al-Wasat. But let me just highlight the organization of this text. So this shows you by volume in the print edition how everything's organized. It's organized geographically, as I mentioned. And the first 6 volumes are devoted to Iraq. And he does 2 things. One is he uses geography to organize the poets. And the other is that he's clearly following some assumptions about social hierarchy and the centrality of certain figures and classes in society. And he puts them first in a section. So I mean, this massive section on Iraq begins with the Baghdad caliphs. There's an enormous amount of material for by and about the caliphs, the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad and their ministers, and then other important Baghdad families. And then he gets to some court poets like al-Haysa. And then what he does is he moves on to religious figures. So judges, hadith transmitters, Quran specialists, and then just other people from his generation that he's met and people he's read about from previous generations. One source that he uses is the Ansab of al-Sam'ani. There were 2 women that 2 female poets that he found in Sam'ani that he gives. And then he goes and records poetry by Bedouin who had made their way into Baghdad society and produced some poetry there. Then he shifts to the geographical organization and covers people from the agricultural area around Baghdad, the Sawad, and then the cities of Hilla, Kufa, Heat, Anbar, Wasat, and Basra. And so when you read any particular section, he often includes a lot of material praising the, in a sort of a mixture of biography and panegyric, praising the minister or the local notables in a region before moving on to less socially prominent figures. And he repeats this over and over again in each geographical section. All right, so here's my case study for today of Shāfiʿī network effects. This is the case of al-Wasat. So al-Wasat, not a big city, it's got 16 poets. In the print edition, this is about 100 pages. And so the important thing to note is that of the 16 poets in the Wasat section, the first 6 take up about half of the material. So this will just give you a look at how literature is moving through religious scholarly networks at this time. So the first person that he gives is Abul Hasan ibn Abi Saqr, and he studied Shāfiʿī fiqh with the first professor of the Baghdad Nizamiya, and was apparently a partisan of the Shāfiʿī right, according to Ibn Khalakhan. Now, interestingly, ʿImād al-Dīn doesn't mention this. You have to go and look in some other sources in order to find out that this Ibn Abi Saqr guy was famous for Shāfiʿī qasidas and for Shāfiʿī partisanship. Shadīd at-ta'assub. Then the next person that he moves on to in this Wasat section, Hibatullah Abu Jawā'iz ibn Bazi, became known to him because the prominent Baghdadi hadith transmitter, Muhammad ibn Nasr, from with whom ʿImād had studied, gotten the hadith ijaza, also transmitted al-Bazzi's poetry. So you see this over and over again with ʿImād is that he hears about someone from, at the beginning it's Egypto-Arab in Isfahan, who seems to be hanging out at the Nizamiya madrasa, but not such a legal or religious figure. And then when he goes to Damascus, he goes and he tries to find all of the people that Egypto-Arab had told him about from his time in Damascus. And he's doing the same thing here. When he was in Baghdad, he knew people from scholarly circles in Baghdad, and when he gets to al-Wasit, he goes and he seeks out the poets or the children of the poets that he had heard about. So his filter is coming from the social network that he had cultivated in Baghdad. The next person that he moves on to is Sheikh Abul Aziz al-Qalanisi al-Muqri'. ʿImād also had an ijaza from Mashaykh who had narrated from him. So he wanted to go and find someone who he'd heard hadith from. Al-Adl Abu Ali ibn Bakhtiyar. He's got some poetry about fleas and bed bugs. And for the next few people, then he says his source was talking to local qadis, local judges. So he arrives in al-Wasit. He has these affiliations and connections from his scholarly and legal social circles in Baghdad from the Nizamiya madrasa. And after being introduced to them, he meets other religious and scholarly figures and gets poetry from them or finds books by them, manuscripts, or other people who could transmit their poetry to him. An interesting bit of information that he gives about how he would track these people down is the next one, Abd Sayyid ibn Jakr, who he had heard about in Isfahan from a Shāfiʿī qadi. And when he asked about him in Baghdad, so he hears about him in Isfahan, and when he goes to Baghdad, he says, does anyone know about Abd Sayyid ibn Jakr? And he wasn't able to, and he mentions that a Christian druggist, Attar, was the one who knew some of his poetry, and then he found some more of it in al-Wasit, which is where he was from. Ibn Dawas al-Qana, from local qadis. So I think this makes the point that quite often when he visits a region, even though it's in his capacity as an administrator, there is a very pronounced profile to the network that he's using to create a representation of the literary culture in a particular area. It's not a neutral description by any stretch of the imagination, and it is given hierarchy, it's given shape, it's geographically organized by his social background. Now, if we go back to, for example, what Matt Keegan was saying about how he includes Shi'i poets or something, in this section we see that there are 3 Shi'i poets, so he does include them. And there's one poet who was known for falsafa, so he wasn't opposed to something that was quote unquote unorthodox, like falsafa philosophy. And I'm running short on time, so I am only going to be able to give one example from al-Wasit before, this is pretty much what I thought would happen, before getting to the panegyric for caliphs. So here's that first guy from al-Wasit, Abul Hasan ibn Abi Saqr. And I found this anecdote interesting because it shows how not only are these figures affiliated with each other from their Shafi'i associations and their networks that they share from having studied in the same place, but they actually commemorate the memory of Nizam al-Mulk himself. And there's a number of poems that ʿImād reproduces which were composed panegyric for Nizam al-Mulk or his sons, because Nizam al-Mulk was famous for having a lot of sons and putting them all into positions of power around the Seljuk domains. So he gives in the typical level of detail that we find with people who are trained in hadith. He says, the Sheikh Abu Majd al-Wa'iz al-Wasiti on the last day of Ramadan 554, recited for me, he said, the Sheikh al-Hasan ibn Abi Saqr recited for me his own poetry, saying that he went out to seek Nizam al-Mulk, but the gatekeeper would not let him into his palace. So he wrote to him a poem, and he says, "You excellent man, your house is paradise, but Malik is standing behind the door," Malik being the angel that guards hell. Nizam al-Mulk opposes a requirement if he's transmitting that from Gehenna. And here he's using some hadith terminology. Yarwi could either mean flowing or it could mean transmitting, which I think is the sort of primary meaning here. And not entirely sure that I've translated this correctly, because the Didd al-Muqtada sounds like some sort of legal technical term that I might be missing. "Be gracious and call off your gatekeeper. I've been punished there too much. Why such harshness at your door? I'm wealthy, I'm not coming for money." And there's a bunch of puns in this. Nizam al-Mulk gives him permission to enter, and he says, "If you don't need money, then leave us be." And Abul Hasan makes another witty joke, and he says, "I came for your right madhhab, not for your gold dhahab." So the anecdote here really illustrates the commemoration of this social group's affiliation with Nizam al-Mulk, with the figure who created these madrasas that they had studied in, their transmission of lore about him, and they're proud, and they cultivate this sort of social capital of having these affiliations with this figure on the basis of a shared Shāfiʿī identity, which isn't going to be surprising to anyone who knows anything about this sort of madhhab politics at this time. But I think for the larger image of literary culture, it's quite important to look at how someone like ʿImād ad-Dīn, who is a major source for literature from the Ayyubid period, is shaped by coming from this social realm of very pronounced madhhab identities. All right, so I got to skip over this because I'm out of time. I'll come to the summary. In the Seljuk and Ayyubid periods, poetry and adab became more central to Islamic scholarly comportment, and by the same token, poetic production provides a platform for scholars and jurists. This increases markedly during the Mamluk period. The Nizamiya madrasas served as incubators for this fusion, and the social networks connected to it amplified what we might call ulama'ized adab. This took place informally, so along the same lines of what Efrat says and others. This wasn't a top-down affair, but it did take place in a milieu of interaction between civilian elites, and an enormous number of them were coming from the east, from Persia. They're just Shāfiʿī Persians are all over the place in Egypt by the early, and Damascus by the early Ayyubid period. And they are jostling with each other, attacking each other for positions in government, and poetry is involved in this mix by which this particular network of civilian elites is trying to position itself in such a way that they can receive sponsorship from the state. So they're involved in a kind of interactive dialogue, or something dialectic happening between them and, say, like the Ayyubids, rather than it being just a top-down thing or a simple bottom-up thing. So that is where I will conclude, and then we can have a discussion or questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much for this invigorating talk. I don't know if I learned why they were called good old boys, but I certainly have some. I think it raises a lot of questions, and so I encourage those who are in the audience to ask questions, large and small. I guess I'll take the prerogative as discussant to ask you a really big question first, and then hopefully that'll set off some other or take us down some other avenues. And I guess that first question relates to really, in some ways, the quotation of a friend, Matt Keegan, thinking about, so on the one hand, he seems to be suggesting that adab can serve, and the anthology can be this space of almost violations of a kind of, be they sectarian or mujun, a sort of licentiousness or whatever way you want, breaking of rules and inversion. It can be a place of kind of where what might be in normal life barriers get broken down. At the same time, you're suggesting quite a different sort of, if you will, functionalist model of adab, where adab is kind of a model sometimes of group cohesion. And then you kind of turned in the end and you sort of told us a little bit about, well, this is also a competitive milieu. And I wonder, I'm in a literature program. I'm happy with things as you have a background in this. Happy with kind of these different functionalist models of literary performance. I wonder, in a way, is that what you're aiming at doing here? Is that the kind of move that you're going to make? Because in some ways, I wonder if in the case of Bauer's, very interesting, the ulamization of adab, vice versa, that locates the literary in almost the person, the producer. And I'm quite skeptical of approaches like that. I think often, adab is something that one would hitch one's wagon to, if you will. To my mind, it sort of puts the cart before the horse, if I may be so bold. So I guess it's a cluster of questions. Where are you actually staking out your claim here in terms of an argument? Are you, is it that there are a variety of models and adab can be all of these different things? Or is there a transformation going on here? That is is it that, how should I put it? The madhhab do become something functional, if you will. And just as Keegan might point to the sectarian, which I think they dovetail in a sort of way ultimately. So tell me a little bit about that.
There's a lot of points that can be made. I think that I'm quite fixated on the way that literature works in terms of what the audience expectations are and where group identity gets formed. So I guess that's perhaps what you mean by functionalist. And I think that is maybe, if I had to make a sort of first characterization of it, I would say that perhaps this is just kind of groundwork for more careful reading of adab as adab, like, let's say. I mean, within our disciplinary world, I think that the texts need to be historicized carefully before we move on to discussions as to how they're working textually. And you need to look at them sort of intertextually, you need to look at like the manuscript tradition, and that's in obviously like in Matt's other work where he's looking at how commentaries are dealing with stuff. That's exactly it's the same sort of overall point. As we want to look at how these folks were actually reading each other rather than projecting our own things onto them. So in a way, one of the things that I would get to in terms of more properly literary questions is this figure that I didn't take the time for, Saladin al-Arjani. And if you look at there's an entry by Geert van Gelder in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Islam, in which he says that al-Arajani doesn't suit our modern tastes because he makes too many puns and he's too ornate and that kind of thing. And so I went through it, and you know, I mean, what does nothing in Arabic poetry suits our modern tastes. And if you go through and you look at al-Arajani, you do need to sort of get a sense of where he's. So the thing that got me interested in al-Arajani is he has a quote in which he calls himself within this context of the ulama. He's also a Shāfiʿī trained faqih, and he calls himself afqa ash-shu'ara wa ash'ar al-fuqaha. He's the most poetic of the religious scholars, and he's the best, the most jurisprudential poet. And so his voice, I think it can be argued, it has a lot of belletristic originality and creativity, but it's also coming from a particular social position that all of this is sort of groundwork for exploring. And so it's part of a larger project. And then that's part of it. So from a literary point of view, that's part of the project, if that makes sense. From a historical point of view, I think, again, we'll take Matt's point as the jumping off point. He's entirely correct that people need to stop reading literature from this period as just being about jihad and Sunnism in this kind of simplistic way, that as opposed to the Crusade. That's a critique of historical use, historiographical use of these texts that I would agree with, and that I think I'm contributing to. And then finally, I think that there's a question of the overall narratives. There's a lot of interest in the Mamluks right now, and I think that there's been a bit of a skipping over the Ayyubids and the Seljuk literary production that needs to be sorted out before we get to the Mamluk period.
Great, thank you. You sort of opened the door to properly literary questions, and I would ask you. You've kind of talked about this as prolegomena to the Mamluks. What about the connections? You know, this is clearly this is a question perhaps inspired by the other quotation by Professor Orfali. And I'm thinking a little bit, as you were talking about ʿImād ad-Dīn as anthologist, but also a man of the chancery. I'm thinking about the usage of poetry, contemporary poetry in prose. To my mind, as I was leafing through my copy of the Kharida, the Iraq portion, I stumbled across the biography of one of the most recent maqama works from that time, the Maqamat al-Nasraniyya, which was just published, which is he dies in 1193, so right within your period, and he has an entry. And I was looking through it, and I noted actually quite interestingly that what is anthologized is once again mainly poetry from the maqamat, excerpts of poetry from the maqamat, even though we see that Hariri is treated differently. And I wondered about that. What do you see? Because typically, of course, we can go back to the 10th century, and you can look at sort of the anthologist's role of collecting poetry. The great prosaist, I'm thinking of Asad, would collect poetry to use in his prose. He said it. I mean, that was kind of the motivation. But what do you think is going on here? Is it what's the relationship that you've found between poetry and prose? For Thalabi, I think the relationship is quite the great 4th century, 10th century anthologist. The relationship is, well, it's very much tied up with letters. And insha and personal insha, the growth of that. What do you see here? What do you see in ʿImād ad-Dīn? I'm curious, as a chancery writer, but also a sort of a literary intellectual. what's his view of adab and its relation to, to this kind of, so because I think it's tied up with actually the Bauer argument as well again.
Yeah. I think there's there's a couple of answers. One is that, in a way he does, again, from the functionalist point of view, and I guess one of my points is that this anthology has a lot of functions, and he had a lot of motivations in composing it, and there's a structure to it, but there's also a lot of layers. So one of them, which is quite clear, is that he's very interested in Insha. He's very interested in chancery stuff. And so when he comes across, and a lot of his connections, another part of his connections, especially when he moves, so in the Maghreb, there's no Shafis. And so when he gets to the Maghreb, that ceases to be, you stop seeing this being the thing that's connecting him to everyone. And there it's Kutab that he has connections with, in this very interesting way, where it almost seems to be kind of like intelligence work for the state, because he's connected to all of the places where people are concerned about the Almohads and where the Sicilians are concerned about the Normans, which were the two main foreign threats in the West that Saladin was interested in or concerned about. So when he gets that material, he's often transmitting just, he does transmit autosile, he transmits, sort of chancery documents. And those are of historical interest. And then he also, there's a kind of like a esprit de corps sort of thing that he has with other bureaucrats, where they have a lot of pen riddles, where they describe something enigmatic and it turns out to be a pen, where they have poems that are describing pen and paper and all of that kind of thing. And examples that can be used for basically cultivating good prose. So that's one aspect of it. I think that it is kind of functional. And then there's another question that I have, which I've been sort of ruminating, and I just have not gotten an answer to really, is what the sort of emotional register or emotional mode is that I think there's a sort of affective interest that on the one hand, these guys are sort of a social group, but they also they enjoy their wine poetry and their puns and all of the things that are properly literary. And so I've been a bit interested in Julia Bray's sort of discussions about Abbasid emotion, but I haven't come to any conclusions about that. And so again, I think that in my thinking, I want to kind of move through these functional purposes that the Kharida serves, and then get to I don't know, trying to understand them better as people who are using poetry for affective purposes, finding out what they're enjoying about it, and how it functions aesthetically. So those are the two sort of directions that that's going in.
That sounds really promising. We have a and thank you. We have a question from our fellow Professor Shine. I'll just read it. Thank you for this talk. I have a small, mite-sized question. That's M-I-T-E. Which is whether you could tell us more about the flea and bedbug poetry. And at the broader level, I hope that's not a reference to the accommodations. Do you think the inclusion of these sorts of poems and of the Attar's recollections tells us something about the anthological disposition? Perhaps portraying the author and or these figures not only as political literary actors, but as in touch with humbler folks and experiences.
So I didn't read the flea poetry carefully. I read the beginning of it, and he was complaining about fleas in a place where he stayed, and then he goes on to describe his misery at having bed bugs. He's got qura, he's got sores all over him. And it seems to be a genre. I've seen some other bedbug poetry in the Kharida. Yeah, Morris, you're nodding, you know about bedbugs. so yeah, I mean, this is a thing with Arabic literature, is that they gradually get more interested in other kinds of genres and things, and those are more fun than panegyric for Abbasid caliphs. I think, well, if I were to relate it to the talk that I'm making today in terms of the anthological disposition, I think it is kind of connected with this hadith mode, because hadith is this cultural practice that really crosses social boundaries in a way. And you do have this, so I guess an analog is on the one, I mean, for hadith in general and for al-Dīn in particular, like 18th century European collection, like as a hobby, where you have people, for example, on the Grand Tour going and visiting places and bringing back stuff to display, and the development of the idea of the museum. So there's some sort of disposition towards collection, which I think could be looked at comparatively. That is what leads him down these roads towards meeting Christian druggists or talking about bed bugs or something. And also the practice of hadith is one that I really couldn't speak to very much in detail about it, but it is what makes him very, very interesting, is this penchant for giving names and dates and transmission for everything. And that does also, as a practice, I mean, you really can't characterize that as either being elite or popular or anything. It's just, but it is becoming more accessible to, if you look at something like Daniela Talman-Heller's Piety in the Ayyubid Period book, you do see that there's, and I think it sort of dovetails with what, to an extent, with what Bauer is doing. There's more popular participation of just folks from all walks of life in certain kinds of scholarly practices, or at least it's well documented from the period. And all of that, I think, goes to show that we shouldn't be too facile about making distinctions between elite and popular literature or anything. But that being said, he does kind of have his hierarchies, and most of the literature is from pretty high-ranking people in society.
Well, thank you. It does strike us that the two, in fact, the modes are in great contrast to one another, even as they're similar, as you say. I mean, that hadith kind of operates often on the authority of the teller. So here, there's great wonder, and it's an undercurrent, I think, running often through works of adab, where wonder is found at kind of the wisdom that comes unexpectedly and outside of those circles. So it's interesting in a way. There's something very, that tension is one that is very, I think, profound ultimately. Well, I say wisdom. I think we need to thank you for your wisdom and hikmah, and leading us to learn more about this pearl of the palace. And so a particular pearl of wisdom. And so thank you very much. And thank you all for attending and your questions. And thank you and good night.